What if the ultimate insult turned out to be the ultimate inheritance? When a billionaire father leaves his estranged son a rotting, worthless cabin in the woods, while the rest of the family inherits millions, it looks like a final act of cruelty. But the dust hid a multi-million-dollar secret. The conference room at Kirkland and Ellis, perched on the 52nd floor of the Citigroup Center in Manhattan, smelled of lemon polish, old money, and barely concealed contempt. Harrison Croft sat at the far end of the sprawling mahogany table, his slightly faded charcoal suit a stark contrast to the aggressive luxury surrounding him. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the New York skyline was swallowed by a bruised, heavy overcast mirroring the suffocating atmosphere inside the room. At the head of the table sat Jonathan Fisk, a senior partner whose billable hourly rate could pay Harrison's rent in Boston for a month. To Fisk's right sat Evelyn Croft, William Croft's third wife, a woman 12 years, Harrison's senior, draped in black cashmere, the subtle scent of Baccarat rouge, 540, trailing her every movement. Beside her, slouched Preston Harrison's 26-year-old half-brother. Preston was busy checking his phone, his bespoke Brioni suit, tailored to inch-perfect precision, his wrist weighed down by a platinum Audemars Piguet. They were here for the reading of the last will and testament of William Croft, the ruthless founder of Croft Enterprises, a commercial real estate empire that owned half of Miami's waterfront and a significant chunk of lower Manhattan. William had died of a massive stroke 4 weeks prior at the age of 71. Harrison hadn't spoken to his father in 8 years. Their estrangement wasn't a slow drift. It was a violent rupture. 8 years ago, Harrison, fresh out of graduate school and working as a junior architect at Gensler, discovered that his father's firm was aggressively using illegal intimidation tactics to force low-income tenants out of a building complex in South Boston. When Harrison confronted him, threatening to go to the state attorney general, William laughed in his face, calling him weak. Harrison walked away from the family, the money and the name building a quiet, anonymous life. Now he was back, summoned by a legally binding mandate. Jonathan Fisk cleared his throat, adjusting his tortoise-shell glasses. We will now proceed with the distribution of the primary assets, as outlined in the revised document dated October of last year. Fisk's voice was a monotonous drone, but the numbers were staggering. Evelyn was granted the 14,000-square-foot primary estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, a waterfront villa in Palm Beach, and sole ownership of the liquid portfolios held at Morgan Stanley, valued at roughly $45 million. Evelyn's face remained a mask of practiced grief, but Harrison caught the slight, triumphant tightening of her jaw. To my youngest son, Preston Croft. Fisk continued turning a heavy parchment page. I leave my controlling 72% stake in Croft Enterprises, the penthouse on Central Park West, and the voting rights to the family's charitable foundation. Preston didn't even look up from his iPhone. Noted. Keep going, Fisk. Fisk paused. He looked up over the rim of his glasses, his eyes briefly meeting Harrison's. There was a flicker of something in the lawyer's expression, pity perhaps, or professional discomfort. And finally, Fisk read his voice, dropping half an octave. To my eldest son, Harrison Croft. You always believed you were morally superior to my wealth. You rejected the empire I built, claiming you preferred the honest grit of the earth. Therefore, I leave you exactly that. I bequeath to Harrison the entirety of Parcel 402, located in Tupper Lake, Franklin County, New York, including all structures, fixtures, and liabilities therein, and nothing else. The room fell dead silent. Then Preston let out a short, barking laugh. Tupper Lake! Preston sneered, slipping his phone into his breast pocket. Isn't that where Dad bought that derelict hunting shack in the 90s to tear down for a tax write-off, the one in the swamp? It is a 4-acre parcel in the Adirondacks. Fisk said evenly, though he couldn't hide his grimace. He reached into his leather briefcase and slid a thick manila envelope across the polished mahogany. It came to a stop in front of Harrison. "The deed is inside, as well as the keys." Harrison didn't reach for the envelope immediately. He stared at it. He had known he was disinherited. He had made peace with that 8 years ago. He didn't want his father's blood money. But the deliberate, calculated nature of this final insult, forcing him to take a day off work, buy a train ticket to New York, and sit in this room just to be handed the deed to a worthless, rotting shack, was a masterful stroke of posthumous cruelty. Evelyn offered a thin, sympathetic smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Well, Harrison, at least you have a place to go camping. Property taxes in Franklin County can't be more than a few $100s a year. I'm sure you can manage that on an architect's salary." Harrison finally moved. He picked up the envelope, feeling the hard lump of an iron key inside. He stood up, buttoning his jacket. He didn't look at Evelyn or Preston. He looked directly at the lawyer. "Is that all, Mr. Fisk?" "That concludes the reading of the estate," Fisk replied quietly. "Enjoy the mosquitoes, Harry," Preston called out to his back as Harrison walked toward the heavy oak doors. "Let us know if you need to borrow a tent." Harrison walked out of the Citigroup Center and into the cold Manhattan rain. He felt a hollow ache in his chest, a mix of finality and lingering anger. He walked down Lexington Avenue, his mind racing. He was tempted to throw the envelope into the nearest storm drain. The cabin was a liability. It was probably a hazard filled with asbestos and black mold. But as he sat on his Amtrak train back to Boston, staring out at the gray blur of the coastline, a strange curiosity took root. His father was a vindictive man, but he was also a man who never wasted a single asset. Why hold on to a worthless piece of swampland for 30 years just to use it as a punchline? He opened the envelope. Inside was a crumbling yellowed deed from 1994 and a heavy, rusted iron key. Taped to the back of the deed was a small yellow post-it note bearing his father's unmistakable sharp handwriting. "The foundation of any empire is what lies beneath the surface. You never understood that." Harrison stared at the note until the words blurred. The next morning, instead of going into the office, he packed a duffel bag, threw a set of heavy tools into the back of his beat-up 2014 Subaru Outback, and pointed his car north toward the deep woods of the Adirondacks. The drive up Interstate 87 was a grueling gray march into isolation. By the time Harrison crossed the border into Franklin County, the cell service on his dashboard had completely vanished, replaced by the persistent drumming of freezing rain against his windshield. He passed the decaying mill town of Tupper Lake, navigating his Subaru, onto a series of increasingly narrow rutted logging roads off State Route 3. Parcel 402 was practically swallowed by the forest. When Harrison finally forced his car through a wall of overgrown hemlock and parked in a sea of mud, he simply sat behind the wheel for 10 minutes, staring at his inheritance. It was worse than Preston had described. The structure was a 1960s A-frame cabin that looked like it was actively surrendering to the earth. The cedar siding was black with rot, the roof sagging precariously under the weight of decades of fallen pine needles. One of the front windows was completely shattered, patched with a piece of plywood that had long since warped and splintered. It wasn't a vacation home. It was a monument to neglect. Harrison pulled his jacket tight, grabbed a heavy LED flashlight and a Stanley Fat Max crowbar from his trunk, and stepped into the freezing mud. He approached the front door. The rusted key from the envelope barely fit into the deadbolt. With a violent shove of his shoulder, the warped door screamed on its hinges and gave way, sending a shower of dust and dead insects falling from the doorframe. The interior smelled of wet earth, raccoon urine, and deep, ancient dampness. Harrison swept his flashlight across the single room. A rusted cast-iron wood stove sat in the center, its pipe entirely disconnected from the ceiling. A filthy mattress lay in the corner, chewed to pieces by rodents. The floor was made of wide, rough-hewn pine boards, many of them bowed and spongy with water damage. A master stroke. William Harrison whispered to the empty room, his breath pluming in the freezing air. "You really outdid yourself." He paced the perimeter, his boots thudding hollowly against the decaying wood. He had driven 5 hours for this. He felt like an absolute fool. The post-it note was just his father's twisted poetry, a final way to make Harrison waste his time and money chasing shadows. He kicked the side of a heavy waterlogged oak dining table sitting near the center of the room. The table shifted. Beneath it, the floorboards didn't just creak. They gave way with a sharp, sickening crack. Harrison stumbled back as his right boot plunged through the rotted pine. He cursed, pulling his leg free from the jagged wood. He shined his flashlight into the hole he had just created, expecting to see the muddy crawl space beneath the cabin. Instead, the beam of light reflected off something dull and grey. Harrison dropped to his knees, ignoring the splinters. He reached his hand into the hole. He didn't feel dirt. He felt smooth, freezing, poured concrete. And running along the concrete was a seam of high-grade steel. His heart performed a strange, sudden flutter in his chest. The foundation of any empire is what lies beneath the surface. Harrison stood up, gripped the Stanley crowbar with both hands, and drove the wedged end into the gap between the pine boards. He threw his entire body weight backward. The rusted nails shrieked as the first board tore free. He moved to the next adrenaline, completely erasing the biting cold of the room. He worked like a man possessed, tearing up 4 square feet of the rotting floor, throwing the planks aside in a cloud of century-old dust. When he finally stopped his chest heaving, the flashlight revealed what his father had hidden beneath the squalor. Set flush into a thick slab of reinforced sub-foundation concrete was a heavy titanium-reinforced steel trapdoor. It looked like a submarine hatch. In the center of the dull metal was a modern digital keypad, a Mas lock, the exact brand Harrison had seen, specified in blueprints for high-security bank vaults. It was immaculate, completely free of dust, running on a hardwired power source. A tiny green LED pulsed faintly in the dark. Harrison fell to his knees, staring at the keypad. His father had built a multi-million-dollar bunker beneath a shack that wasn't worth $50 in firewood. But how to open it? Harrison stared at the glowing numbers. A Mas lock would permanently lock down after 3 incorrect attempts. He couldn't just guess. He thought about his father's arrogant, structured mind. William Croft didn't do random. He did significant. Harrison typed in his father's birthday, March 12th, 53. A harsh beep echoed in the room. The LED flashed red. Attempt 1 failed. Harrison wiped a streak of dirty sweat from his forehead. He thought of Evelyn's birthday, Preston's. No, William wouldn't use them for this. This was his secret. This was the money he hid from his own empire. Harrison remembered the day everything fell apart, the blowout argument in the Manhattan office, the day he walked away from the family. It was the day William told Harrison he was dead to him. His hand shaking, Harrison reached down and typed the date of their estrangement. August 14th, 2016. The keypad chirped. The red light blinked once, then turned a solid, bright green. Deep within the concrete, a heavy mechanized deadbolt clanked backward. The sound was deafening in the quiet cabin. Harrison grabbed the heavy steel handle, braced his boots against the concrete, and pulled. The trapdoor lifted on hydraulic hinges, releasing a rush of dry, climate-controlled air that smelled of ozone and leather. A set of steel stairs led down into the darkness. As Harrison's boot hit the first step, motion sensors triggered a row of recessed LED strip lights, illuminating the subterranean vault. Harrison descended slowly, his breath catching in his throat. The room was roughly 20 by 20 feet walls, lined in pristine white steel. It looked like a private storage facility in Geneva. Along the left wall were 4 massive fireproof Pelican cases stacked neatly. On the right wall sat an industrial shelving unit. Harrison walked toward the shelves. Stacked in perfect gleaming pyramids were dozens of heavy silver ingots, each stamped with the Credit Suisse logo. Next to them sat a row of velvet display boxes. Harrison flipped one open to find a vintage Rolex Daytona, its face pristine, alongside a stack of uncirculated 1804 silver dollars each, encased in rigid plastic from the professional coin grading service. But it was what sat in the center of the room that changed everything. Resting on a small stainless steel table was a thick, black, leather-bound ledger, and next to it, a single manila folder, stamped with the logo of the Securities and Exchange Commission, marked Confidential. Harrison opened the ledger. It wasn't a list of assets. It was a record of debt. Page after page detailed the true state of Croft Enterprises. The company wasn't worth billions. It was drowning in toxic leverage. The Greenwich mansion had 3 hidden liens against it. The commercial properties in Miami were collateral for massive high-interest loans from private equity firms. The SEC folder contained draft indictments for massive corporate fraud, tax evasion, and embezzlement spanning 2 decades. Harrison read the documents, his blood running cold as the reality of the situation washed over him. William Croft hadn't left Preston and Evelyn an empire. He had left them a ticking time bomb. The moment the probate cleared the banks and the federal government would descend, tearing Preston and Evelyn to shreds, seizing everything, locking them in a labyrinth of federal charges and bankruptcy. And Harrison, the disowned son, he looked around the bunker. Millions of dollars in untraceable silver gold, rare watches, and bearer bonds. No deeds, no digital footprint, no tax liabilities. His father hadn't banished him to the wilderness to suffer. He had banished him to the wilderness to save him from the blast radius. Harrison stood utterly frozen in the subterranean vault, the cold steel binding of the ledger feeling impossibly heavy in his trembling hands. The suffocating silence of the deep Adirondack woods above was absolute, but in his mind, the deafening catastrophic collapse of the Croft Empire had already begun. He carefully closed the black leather binder, setting it back on the stainless steel table. He turned his attention to the 4 massive military-grade Pelican cases stacked neatly against the pristine white steel of the left wall. He reached out and unlatched the first case. The heavy plastic clasps snapped open, the sound echoing like gunshots in the enclosed bunker. Inside, nestled tightly in custom-cut charcoal acoustic foam, lay rows of crisp, meticulously bound bearer bonds. Unlike modern registered securities, these paper certificates belonged entirely and legally to whoever physically held them. Harrison reached in and picked up a thick bundle. They were issued by the Union Bank of Switzerland, each individual bond stamped with a staggering denomination of $100,000. He quickly counted 50 certificates in the first stack alone. That was $5 million in a single handful. He moved to the second case, his breath shallow, his hands shaking slightly against his will. It contained tightly bound stacks of pristine, uncirculated $100 bills, perfectly vacuum-sealed in thick industrial plastic to prevent any moisture damage over the decades. The third heavy case held a breathtaking collection of rare, flawless diamonds, securely sealed in individual blister packs, certified by the Gemological Institute of America. Alongside the gems sat a small, unassuming steel safe deposit key, tied to a brass tag that simply read LGT Bank, Liechtenstein. The fourth and final case contained a series of high-level identity documents. Harrison picked up a burgundy passport. It bore his own photograph, an alias he didn't recognize, and full citizenship documentation to St. Kitts and Nevis. Beside it, lay a secure, encrypted hardware wallet taped to a piece of waterproof paper containing a complex 12-word seed phrase for a massive offshore cryptocurrency account. His father had systematically and ruthlessly drained the lifeblood from Croft Enterprises, converting stolen corporate leverage fraudulent loans and embezzled funds into untraceable liquid physical wealth. He had buried it beneath the only worthless property the federal government would never bother to investigate or seize. While Harrison meticulously catalogued the staggering fortune hidden beneath the rotting floorboards of Tupper Lake, the carefully constructed, glittering facade of Croft Enterprises began to spectacularly implode 300 miles away in Manhattan. Preston Croft was sitting comfortably in the exclusive executive dining room of the Harvard Club, enjoying a perfectly dry martini and aggressively flirting with a newly hired junior analyst when his phone began to vibrate violently against the polished mahogany table. The caller ID flashed Jonathan Fisk. Preston ignored the first 3 desperate calls, finding the senior lawyer's sudden, uncharacteristic persistence highly irritating. When he finally answered on the 4th ring, Fisk's voice was completely stripped of its usual haughty, arrogant professionalism. It was reduced to a high, reedy, breathless panic. "Where exactly are you right now?" Fisk demanded, his breathing ragged and echoing loudly through the receiver. "Do not go back to the office. Preston, are you listening to me carefully? Do not go back to the Citigroup Center under any circumstances." Preston frowned deeply, swirling the expensive olive in his crystal glass. "Calm down, Fisk. You sound hysterical. What on earth are you rambling about?" "The Securities and Exchange Commission just raided the 48th floor." Fisk hissed his voice, dropping to an urgent whisper. "They have federal warrants. The FBI is with them right now. They are actively seizing the private servers, the physical financial files, the executive hard drives, absolutely everything. They just unilaterally froze all of the corporate accounts. Your father—" Fisk actually choked on the words, a dry, terrified gasp. "Your father illegally leveraged the entire property portfolio using grossly falsified collateral. The hidden debt is absolutely astronomical. The Miami waterfront properties are heavily in default. The firm is completely insolvent. You are the CEO now, Preston. You proudly signed the fiduciary assumption documents just yesterday morning." Preston's martini glass slipped abruptly from his numb fingers, shattering violently against the ancient hardwood floor. The junior analyst jumped back, startled by the noise, but Preston didn't even notice her. The color drained completely from his arrogant face, leaving him a sickening shade of pale gray. "That's completely impossible. We have over 50 million in liquid capital." "Frozen," Fisk replied grimly, the word dropping like an anvil. "Evelyn's private accounts were heavily margin-called early this morning by Morgan Stanley." The federal government firmly believes the Greenwich estate was purchased using heavily embezzled corporate funds. They are actively drafting a comprehensive indictment for widespread wire fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion. You need to secure elite criminal defense counsel immediately, Preston. I can no longer legally represent you. The line went dead. Preston stood utterly paralyzed in the middle of the Harvard Club dining room, surrounded by the quiet, refined murmurs of the city's elite, suddenly realizing with horrific clarity that he was a dead man walking. He wasn't the king of a billionaire empire. He was the sole legal inheritor of a massive, radioactive financial crater. Back in the quiet isolation of Tupper Lake, Harrison methodically packed the damning ledger, the SEC files, and a large handful of the bearer bonds into his heavy canvas duffel bag. He securely locked the Pelican cases, resealed the heavy Cabermas vault door, and carefully replaced the shattered pine floorboards, dragging the heavy oak dining table back over the secret entrance to conceal it. He walked out into the freezing Adirondack rain, his mind remarkably clear and singularly focused. He drove carefully down the winding mountain roads and stopped at a quiet, unassuming local diner on Park Street. Ordering a simple black coffee, He watched the small staticky television mounted high above the pie display case. The breaking news banner flashed aggressively across the bottom of the screen in glaring red letters. Federal raid at Croft Enterprises, Manhattan real estate empire, implicated in massive historic fraud. Harrison took a slow, deliberate sip of his bitter coffee. The hot liquid grounded him in the surreal reality of the moment. He felt absolutely no pity for Evelyn or Preston. They had spent their entire privileged lives maliciously mocking his integrity, endlessly gorging themselves on a lavish feast paid for by the active suffering of low-income tenants and aggressively ruthless corporate bullying. Now the catastrophic bill had finally arrived at their table. His father, in his final incredibly twisted act of posthumous judgment, had weaponized the inheritance itself. He deliberately handed Preston the heavy golden crown, fully knowing the fatal guillotine blade was permanently attached to it. And he quietly gave Harrison the disowned son, the only viable escape pod. The following 6 months were a spectacular public execution of the once mighty Croft legacy. The financial media descended like starving vultures. Evelyn's sprawling Greenwich estate was aggressively seized under federal asset forfeiture laws within a matter of weeks. She publicly auctioned her prized jewelry and art to afford a criminal defense attorney. She relocated to a cramped apartment in Queens, entirely abandoned by her friends. Preston faced significantly worse consequences. As head of Croft Enterprises, federal prosecutors aimed the devastating weight of the Justice Department squarely at Preston. He was formally indicted on 22 counts of corporate fraud and conspiracy. His watch was confiscated, his passport revoked, and he awaited a trial carrying a maximum sentence of 35 years. Meanwhile, Harrison remained entirely invisible to the chaotic media circus. He legally changed his name to Harrison Gallagher, adopting his late mother's maiden name, and quietly resigned from his position at Gensler in Boston. Over the harsh winter, he took several calculated discreet trips to Zurich and Vaduz, utilizing the offshore contacts, physical keys, and encrypted passwords left waiting in the subterranean bunker. Working with elite Swiss bankers, he systematically liquidated the bearer bonds and transferred the hidden cryptocurrency fortunes into secure, legitimate corporate entities registered in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. He washed the untraceable physical wealth through a legally flawless labyrinth of holding companies until it emerged spotless. He was now the sole proprietor and CEO of Vanguard Holdings, a fiercely private equity firm boasting a clean, liquid capital base of $45 million. Absolutely no one, not even forensic accountants at the federal government, could tie his new fortune to the toxic ruins of his father's fallen empire. One crisp, clear morning in early April, Harrison confidently walked into a sterile, crowded bankruptcy court in Lower Manhattan. He wore a tailored navy blue suit, blending perfectly with the army of aggressive creditors, anxious bankers, and exhausted lawyers swarming the echoing halls. Today was the final liquidation hearing for the pathetic remnants of Croft Enterprises. The firm's smaller architectural subsidiaries were being desperately auctioned off for pennies on the dollar to satisfy the ravenous demands of severely defrauded international banks. Preston was there sitting rigidly at the defendant's table. The brutal 6 months had visibly aged him a decade. His once styled hair was thinning drastically, his posture was violently slouched, and the formerly expensive suit he wore now hung pathetically off his gaunt frame. Evelyn sat directly behind him in the crowded gallery, her face pale, her lips pressed tightly into a thin, bitter line of perpetual anger. They looked exactly like hollow ghosts haunting the miserable graveyard of their historic greed. The presiding federal judge banged his wooden gavel, demanding total silence. "Next item on the docket," the judge announced. "The Boston architectural subsidiary, Croft Design. Valued at roughly $2 million. Do we have an opening bid from the floor?" Harrison calmly raised his bright yellow numbered placard high. $3 million, Your Honor," Preston violently whipped his head around his sunken eyes, widening in terrified shock, as he immediately recognized the quiet man sitting in the back row. Evelyn let out a sharp gasp. Harrison met his brother's desperate stare with icy calm. He simply held the placard steadily high. $3 million legitimately bid by Vanguard Holdings, the judge stated loudly. Going once, going twice, officially sold. Preston frantically scrambled out of his wooden chair, entirely ignoring his defense attorney's frantic whispers to sit down. He pushed violently past the wooden doors and marched aggressively down the aisle directly toward Harrison. "Harry, what is this?" Preston hissed maliciously. "Where did you possibly get that kind of liquid money? You are a completely broke architect." "I am an independent investor." "Now, Preston," Harrison replied evenly, sliding his yellow placard neatly into his expensive leather briefcase. "I specialize heavily in acquiring deeply distressed assets and subsequently fixing them." Evelyn rushed over, aggressively grabbing Preston's arm to pull him forcefully back. She glared intensely at Harrison with a venomous hatred. "Your horrible father left you a rotting shack in a freezing swamp, Harrison. Do not act like you are somehow better than us today. You walked away with absolutely nothing." Harrison looked closely at Evelyn, vividly remembering the softly glowing green light of the vault. "You are entirely right, Evelyn," Harrison said softly. "He intentionally left me a heavily rotting, incredibly ugly shack, but it had a very solid foundation underneath it. Goodbye, Preston. Good luck with the federal sentencing." Harrison turned sharply and walked confidently out of the silent courtroom. That weekend, Harrison Gallagher drove his truck back up the winding roads to the Adirondacks. He parked in the drying mud, walked slowly into the decaying cabin, and looked down at the heavy oak table. He did not need the secure bunker anymore. The vast wealth was completely safe, legally secured, and actively growing. He walked calmly outside, retrieved a heavy red plastic gasoline canister from his truck bed, and systematically doused the heavily rotten cedar siding, the collapsed roof, and the warped interior floorboards. He struck a single wooden match and tossed it lightly onto the soaked porch. The hungry flames caught instantly, roaring rapidly to life, with violent, beautiful heat, eagerly consuming the long decades of rot secrets and deliberate neglect. Harrison stood quietly in the peaceful forest clearing, watching his father's legacy burn. Wow! What an unbelievable twist of fate. Harrison thought he was thrown away by his family, only to find out his father left him the only real wealth that mattered, while handing his arrogant brother and stepmother an absolute nightmare. If you enjoyed this real-life drama of hidden treasure, justice, and revenge, please hit the like button, share this video with your friends, and make sure to subscribe to our channel so you never miss another thrilling story.